Do you know what's stopping you from doing that one thing you've always wanted to do? You don't, because it doesn't exist. This is Josh Bauer, and no, it really doesn't exist.
Navient being required to settle for $1.83 billion.
So that's really what I want to tell you about today. I want you to walk out thinking, man, how do I dominate? Not other people. How do I start dominating my own self?
They basically looked at all the rules and they maximized their income, and then they made sure they kept as much of it as possible.
If you sell your company and you have enough money, or you make enough money that you don't actually have to work again,
somewhere in the range of 50-50 stocks and bonds and 75-25 stocks and bonds in a diversified portfolio of low-cost index funds.
I want you to stop asking $3 questions and start asking $30,000 questions.
What you just heard was a compilation of some of my favorite podcasters, specifically in personal finances, business, and real estate. You know, all the way back in like 7th grade, I learned about this concept. It's called locus of control, and I've heard it brought up a number of times since then. Basically, a locus of control is the mindset that a person has regarding whether or not they have the ability to control the things around them. And in a lot of cases, you can control the things around you, and in some cases, you can't. There's a really nice chart I've seen at one point. Basically, it shows two circles, one of them smaller, one of them's a bigger circle, and everything in the smaller circle you have some level of influence over. Everything in the larger circle on the outside you can't really control, like the weather, etc., politics, unless you're a politician. You get my point. A lot of things as an individual you really don't have the ability to control. Stuff within your life you can control. Now, your finances is one of those things that you can control, and you know, if you think that you can't, you have what's called an external locus of control. You think everything's predetermined. You don't think you have the ability to affect some of these things. And the fact is, in 99% of the cases, you do. So right off the bat, if you're listening to this podcast with an expectation of entertainment, I would say just skip over it. This is intended for people who are interested in learning about personal finances, how to improve themselves, and how to acquire more money, how to keep it, and how to multiply it, in the words of Grant Cardone, one of my favorite people when it comes to specifically real estate. But that said, before I give my recommendation for my top 10 favorite podcasters when it comes to money, I want to caveat a couple other things. So I guess there are a couple different learning styles that are important to acknowledge when it comes to learning how to manage your money. Obviously, you learn as a kid the different types of learning styles. There's like audible, visual, and then kinetic, or whatever it is, when you have to feel stuff with your hands or really experience it in order to learn it. And I think that a lot of people, including myself to some degree, have to really experience something before it clicks in their head. But at the same time, if you're somebody who can't really learn much from a podcast just because it's not the way you learn, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you consider a book a visual way of learning. I have always considered myself, I don't really think I lean too heavily towards any specific one. I think I kind of am fairly distributed across all three. I can learn well from books, from experiencing things, and also from auditory or audio, whatever. That said, books are definitely another good way to go, and I might do another episode on books, but I'm going to stay out of them for this episode because this is podcast only. But, if you don't really learn through audio that much, then it is what it is. There are other ways for you to learn about personal finances that will also be effective. And, I mean, there are people, you'll be able to find people too, in some cases for free, if you look hard enough, who are willing to help you out for free, that will sit down with you and work with you on this type of stuff. So it's not just through means of buying resources and buying books and that sort of thing. You can find people that will help you out. All that to say, if you don't learn well from podcasts, you're not out of luck. But that said, I think if you are someone who is able to just put in headphones while you're at work or while you're driving and listen to something, and you don't have to learn from 100% of it. There's some statistic, I think humans, when they listen to a speaker or a podcast or whatever, like they only retain a very small percentage. I think it was something, don't quote me on this, but it's like somewhere between 4% or 7% or some ridiculously low number of all information that they heard is what they retain, what they remember. So it's not expected that you're going to remember everything you hear and that you're going to memorize it. But a lot of times when you hear something multiple times, it tends to solidify in your brain. The neural pathways tend to connect. They get bigger every time the signal is sent to your brain. Every time you hear something, the neural pathways in your brain widen, and it makes it easier for you to remember. So even if you don't remember it the first time, the more you listen to this stuff, the more it drills it into your head. And when you have all that background knowledge, it does come in useful later on in real life decisions. So without further ado, let's begin with my top 10 recommendations for personal finance podcasts. Dave Ramsey is right at the top of my list. In fact, I would go so far as to say that he is at the top of the personal finance pyramid. Almost all, if not all of the people that are going to be on this list will mention or have mentioned Dave Ramsey at some point on their show, in their podcast, in their interviews, etc. And that's really the way that you know that somebody is basically as credible as it gets, is when everybody else talks about them. And generally speaking, everybody else talks about him in a positive light. Now, there are definitely plenty of disagreements, and a lot of those disagreements tend to have to do with Dave Ramsey's objection to the use of debt and credit cards, and his objection to the way in which people kind of glorify credit scores and whatnot. A lot of people disagree on that, but most of the other stuff, they tend to agree with basically most of the principles that he has. And now Dave Ramsey has a podcast. It's called The Ramsey Show. And this is a show where people call in and he gives them advice on their situations. Usually it's people that are experiencing financial difficulty of some sort or are seeking advice about a technical question. 90% of it has to do with finances. Sometimes you'll get tangents about relationships and things of that nature. Usually it's financially a financially driven conversation. Now, this is interesting, but Dave Ramsey was actually the first podcast that I've ever listened to. But let me just clarify for a minute. First of all, at this point in time, I listen to, I would say, 50 different podcasts somewhat regularly. But Dave Ramsey, I listened to him before I listened to his podcast. So I initially started listening to him on the radio. This was when I was probably 16 years old when I first started listening to him. It was a talk radio show out in Waterloo, where I grew up, is where I got the reception. I think it was 95.9 was the radio station. And they had Clark Howard. Here's another guy on there. He's not on my list. He's not bad, but I just always kind of found his voice a little monotone and boring, and he didn't really help me much in terms of education. But I'm sure he's good too. But Clark Howard, Dave Ramsey were on that radio station. Brian Kilmeade, Mark Levin, which were some conservative political radio, talk hosts. And talk radio, I think, always geared towards conservative politics because it was typically older people that would still be listening to radio, with me being an exception, I guess. And older people generally tend to lean conservative, I guess. So that's why. But that's where I initially discovered Dave Ramsey. Now, what's Dave Ramsey going to help you with? Dave Ramsey is very well known for, and sometimes criticized for, his basic principles and his basic, very rudimentary advice about how to get yourself back together. This is not the place where you go for super fancy investing techniques or for... Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that he's not knowledgeable on this type of stuff, but his methodology of teaching people is very, very basic and simple, which is get out of debt, don't spend more than you make, and just a couple other concepts that seem like they should be common sense, but a lot of people don't apply them properly. And a lot of his advice is not just telling people these things; it's telling them how to do it better. So how to have self-control. And he has a system that he recommends, which is called the envelope system, where you put cash in an envelope, and instead of spending with your credit card, you go to a store and you pay for things in cash, so that when your money runs out, you cannot spend any more money than you had budgeted that month for you to spend. And it's just simple stuff like that, not just him telling you to not spend more than you make or to not spend more than you budget for, but actually practical advices on how to implement this stuff. Because, to take a quote from his show, personal finances is 80% behavior and 20% math. Because people don't know how to spend less than they make. And if you're listening to this thinking, I really don't need to listen to this guy, he sounds like he's too basic for me. I want to know the fancy stuff like compound interest, and not just compound interest, but what different investments gets me the best interest rates and stuff. I'm telling you right now that if you have a limited exposure to personal finance, or even if you don't, either way, I really would highly recommend that you listen to this guy's radio show, and him specifically. He has a couple other people now that he's a little older, and I think he's going to retire soon. He's getting older. But I would recommend you specifically find the shows where he is talking, and I think this is an amazing foundation for you to build concepts in your head of what steps you need to implement in your life and what behaviors you need to be adamant on implementing in order to have success with your money. So that's Dave Ramsey. He's my number one, and he is absolutely the first one that I would recommend you check out first. Number 2 on my list is going to be Ken Coleman. Now, Ken Coleman actually works alongside Dave Ramsey. He works for Dave Ramsey, actually. Ken Coleman has his own little niche topic, though, and that is careers. So Ken Coleman has the same style of radio show as Dave Ramsey. In fact, I actually started listening to his show the same way as Dave Ramsey's, which was over that radio station. And Ken Coleman will basically take calls, and he will answer people's questions as it relates to the kind of job that they want to do, and not just what kind of job will make them a lot of money. It's not just a career show in terms of getting the most pay out of whatever industry possible. It is about trying to find a job that is fulfilling for you and that you find interest in doing, and that makes you feel good every day. It makes you want to come into work every day, right? And then, of course, he pulls in the practical side of that, which is the money. I will say the one thing about Ken Coleman's show is it does seem to get a little bit repetitive, and that's not a bad thing on his part, because a lot of times the best answer to something is the same answer every time it's asked, right? Consistency is not a bad thing in this realm of personal finances or even careers. Just because something's repetitive, it tends to get boring over time. And that's not a bad thing. It means it's consistent, which means it's probably a good answer. But I will say that after listening to Ken Coleman a little while, it'll start to be just the same thing on repeat, and you'll want to kind of put him down and start listening to something else. That's just my opinion. Now, sometimes he does talk about current events and that sort of thing, and how employers, he talks about employer stuff too. So not just from an employee's point of view, but he'll talk about, if you're an employer, how to make your workers happier working for you. And that side of it's certainly interesting and kind of brings a new topic to his show that makes me want to stay there a little bit more. But other than that, after listening to him a while, I do think you'll start to get it down pretty well. Meaning the types of things that he talks about and the types of answers that he gives to the people who are calling in. And predictable is not always a bad thing. That means you're catching on to the subject matter. That when a caller calls into a show, whether it's Ken Coleman or Dave Ramsey, and they ask a question, and you can answer their question in your own head before the radio host actually answers their question, that's how you know that you're learning, maybe even subconsciously, from them over however long you've been listening to the podcast. I think that repetition is good for drilling stuff into your head. And Ken Coleman actually has this whole quiz and stuff that basically you take the quiz and it kind of tells you what type of work you are programmed to do. And when I say programmed, obviously that's a term that's kind of more used in technology. But in human psychology, I guess people have different personalities, and some people, obviously there's different ways of categorizing that, whether it's extrovert and introvert, or just there's a bunch of different ways of categorizing what type of personality you have on so many different levels. And depending on your personality, you're going to be more inclined to do one type of work over another. And his quiz does a very excellent job of breaking that down based on what I've heard people say in reviews. I haven't taken it myself. But I definitely recommend listening to Ken Coleman when it comes to career fields and whatnot. That brings me on to my third podcast recommendation, which is going to be Choose FI. Now, FI stands for Financial Independence. Basically, this ties in very closely with what's called a FIRE movement, which is financially independent, retire early, I believe. And basically, the idea behind the FIRE movement is that you want to save up enough money as fast as you can to retire extremely early, like in your 30s or 40s, and then you don't have to work in your 50s, 60s. You get to retire like 20 years early, and that's 20 years less that you have to work, and then you just live off of the interest from the money that you saved up. So obviously, if you have a bank account, you're probably getting like 0.1% interest if it's a checking account or something, APY, annual percentage yield. If it's a high yield savings account, maybe as much as 4%. I know that's what I've seen recently, which is not bad. The idea is with Choose FI, and you'll hear this when you start listening to the podcast. You won't need me to explain this to you after you start listening to their show, because they explain it much better than I could. But the idea is you save up a certain amount of money, and it's not going to be in a bank account. It's going to be in a stock market. Or, whatever, mostly the stock market. And theoretically, you're getting a rate of return of 8% per year. And you have to save up enough money to where 4% of that amount can cover all of your expenses in a year. And why is it 4%? Well, 4% is just kind of the generally agreed upon number. And the reason for that is, if you're making 8% in interest or dividends or appreciation or whatever, then in income every year. So let's say you have, let me pull out my calculator here. Okay, let's say you have $1 million saved up. Bear with me. Okay, $1 million. Now, 8% of that is going to be $80,000. So let's say that your $1 million is in the stock market and it is appreciating $80,000 a year, roughly, because compound interest means it's a little more than next year, a little more than next, etc. But 4% is only going to be $40,000. So basically, if you're making $80,000, but you're only taking out $40,000, the $40,000 has to be enough to cover your expenses, and you're still making another 40. But the thing is, the stock market isn't always predictable, so it's not always going to be that 8%. Sometimes it might be negative 2% if the stock market goes down. So that's why there's a gap between the 8% and the 4%. The 4% is a very conservative number, so that it's like an average out of all the years, right? Out of all the 20 years or whatever that you're saving up money, 4% is a conservative average to where you can take out 4% of that money every single year after you retire, and theoretically, your savings amount will not diminish at all because of the average appreciation it'll get over time. So that is the basis of Choose FI, except FI kind of is a deviation from the FIRE movement, Financial Independence, Retire Early. The deviation comes from the fact that Choose FI and their whole philosophy kind of breaks away and is more open to other possibilities besides just laying on a beach and doing nothing for the next 20 years after you retire at age 40. A lot of these people, there's different kinds of there are different paths, and they're more open, but they also cover a much larger range of topics, mostly in terms of technical optimization. So I'm just going to be upfront with you. Maybe this isn't, well, for sure, I don't think this should be the very first podcast you listen to if you're just getting into financial management, personal finances. I think Dave Ramsey is definitely the best place to start. This one is once you're willing to start digging into the details a little bit and actually getting technical knowledge, actually getting smarter in terms of different types of retirement funds, 401ks, IRAs. There's, loopholes, tax loopholes, like backdoor Roths, basically, Roth conversion ladders, a bunch of different ways to make sure that like you put money in a tax, a pre-tax account, and then when you're not making any money, you convert it over into a post-tax account, and basically just loopholes that they teach you. And it's good to know, but it's not the stuff that's gonna make you rich. It's the stuff that's gonna help out. But the stuff that's really gonna make you rich is just, in Dave Ramsey's words, is your income. Your biggest wealth building tool, as he says, is your income. And that's basically just the standard principles of living on less than you make and trying to have a decent income and, living below your means and not going into debt. Like very, very basic principles. In fact, if you are listening to this podcast just trying to get some very basic principles, I would say what I said in the last 20 seconds, just rewind that and listen to it over and over in your head. And start listening to Dave Ramsey. That I know I'm not supposed to keep talking about him. I'm going through the rest of the list, but that's how you get there. And then the rest of the stuff is just either how to fine tune it, or if you're into business, some of the stuff gets into business more than just personal finances, and that's where the rest of the list will continue here. So yeah, Choose FI. Go check it out. Definitely, I recommend it if you're interested in more of the technical stuff. Number 4 is a podcast by Ramit Sethi. It was formerly known as I Will Teach You to Be Rich. That was the name of the podcast. He recently changed it to Money for Couples. Now, back when I was working at New Path Learning, it's a board game production company in Victor, New York. Great job, by the way, great company. They make really good products there. I was listening to podcasts all the time, and this was one of the main podcasts that I listened to. That was back in 2022 summer. And basically, this is one guy and couples, married couples usually. They're not always married, but they come on to his podcast, and it's more of like a marriage counseling type thing, but it's specifically related to money. All of it's related to money, and they come on there, and he basically coaches them through how to get their shit together and fix their finances, because usually they're a hot mess when it comes to spending and communication. That's a big thing. So this is, if you have a spouse or a partner, this is definitely a very this would be a very productive and helpful, beneficial podcast for you to listen to, even if it's just yourself listening to it and not the other person. It would be, if both of you listen to it, that's good too. But this is one of those things where you can just ask yourself, you can hear problems, and sometimes problems are so easy to identify when you're listening to somebody else. Like when they're somebody else's problems, they're easier to identify than when they're your own. And if you listen to somebody else's problems, sometimes you'll be like, you know what? That's kind of a problem with me too, isn't it? And I think, even if, I don't have a girlfriend right now, and I didn't when I first started listening to these podcasts, but nonetheless, it's very, very interesting, and I think it sets a really good foundation for when you do intend on making financial decisions, especially big ones, with anybody else, or discussing finances with anybody else that you're interested in marrying. It really, not only does it help you to be on the same page with money, but it's going to basically change the course of the rest of your life. I guarantee you, if you, I believe statistically money is the number one reason why people get divorced after they are married. And I can't say really from personal anecdote from the people around me. I haven't seen a whole lot of money issues with marriages around me, but I can say that I can certainly imagine, based on some of my own experiences, how much successful teamwork and communication and cooperation can make a huge difference. Some people like to spend money. Some people are very controlling of their money. Some people are dishonest. A lot of these, spending money isn't a bad thing. But, there needs to be boundaries if the money is being spent, behind your back or in a way that exceeds your income in any way that's not sustainable. And both people need to work together. Ramit Sethi, I was just blown away by how well, you would think he has a PhD in psychology or something, but he is amazing. He's very insightful. And all of the things he talks about definitely apply to you as an individual person too. It's not just for couples. There are only couples that go on his podcast, but I guarantee you, even if you don't get married for another 10 years, all of the stuff that you listen to from his podcast will be directly applicable to your own life individually. And like I said, it's more of a marriage counseling type deal, related specifically to money, but it is an amazing listen, and I highly recommend his podcast. Number five is going to be Grant Cardone. Now, Grant Cardone, for one reason or another, has been all types of controversial, and it's kind of funny. Now, he's a controversial figure. Honestly, I would equate him more to the personality of Donald Trump. I think if you like Donald Trump in terms of his personality, in terms of his business competency, then I think you will have a similar interest in Grant Cardone. But Grant Cardone's not a politician, though. I'll tell you what he is. He's very into real estate, and when I say into, I mean he owns tens of thousands of apartment units, right? And some of these, in fact, a number of them are in Miami, all over the country, though. He owns them all over the country, and basically, he has an amazing story about how he was at a really low point in his life, and a couple different places, but it stemmed out of his childhood, where I guess his father died and his mom didn't have much left over to care for his family at the time, and he was like, I'm gonna make sure that my family never has to go through the same thing. And so he has this level of motivation that I don't have, and I wish I had it. I think he started at like a very late age when it comes to the real estate stuff. I think he started in his 40s or 50s. So hopefully the more time that I have available to myself, because I'm younger when I'm starting, hopefully that'll make up for his differential in motivation. But that said, his advantage in motivation, I should say. He really bulldozed his way through figuring out how to successfully buy and rent out rental properties. And he doesn't really do the flipping stuff very much. He'll buy it and he'll do a couple things to it, raise the rents, I guess. But he's not as much of a fix and flip guy as he is buy it in somewhat usable condition, not have to do too much to it except raise the rents and start renting it out again. Now, he's a big proponent of using leverage, as he calls it, which is using debt to go and buy more properties, and it is what it is. But just keep that in mind. I'm just telling you right now, I have an intention. I'm 21, and I definitely intend on buying rental properties within the next 3 or 4 years at least. And I don't intend on using debt. I intend on just saving up for it and buying them outright. And the reason for that is I like the idea of not having to worry about payments. And I've also been partially brainwashed by Dave Ramsey and the whole no debt thing as well. I'll fully admit that my conclusion on this topic is not fully my own and is a result of conditioning from the past 3, 4, 5 years. Oh, hell, 6 years. I've been listening to these people since I was 15, 16. So, yeah. But as I was saying, Grant Cardone had no idea what he was doing when he first started out. And now he has done it so many times and has done it on properties that are worth like millions, hundreds. I don't think it's an exaggeration. Down in Miami, like these multi-unit properties down in Miami, hundreds of millions of dollars. So he's extremely knowledgeable. Not only is he extremely knowledgeable, but he words this stuff in a way that's easy for regular people to understand, and he's highly motivating, and he's really, for me, he's a fun person to listen to, and you can get a lot of good knowledge out of this. My next recommendation, which is going to be number 6, is the Bigger Pockets Real Estate Podcast. Now, this also has to do with real estate. Here's the thing about this. They have on guests. Now, Grant Cardone, sometimes, I guess he interviews people a lot. They're not always real estate people. I mean, he interviewed Donald Trump between, what was it, like 2022. I think he interviewed. Did I say emailed? The first time, interviewed Donald Trump. And Donald Trump had a lot to do with real estate, but I guess my point is, like, real estate is not his only target for people to interview. He interviews all sorts of people, and even then, to be honest, even when he does interview real estate people, in my opinion, a lot of times it's kind of to bring the focus back on himself, which is what it is. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing necessarily, but Bigger Pockets, on the other hand, they interview only real estate people for the most part, and basically all their episodes are on the topic of real estate, and they cover 1,000 different angles on real estate. I mean, Grant Cardone, for the most part, he sticks with one thing, and if you want to know about, like, buying rental properties and just doing what he did, then he's a great person to listen to. But if you want to know more angles, Bigger Pockets is a great way of, they'll break down every single angle that you can think of when it comes to real estate. They did a couple episodes on tax liens, tax deeds, which is obviously my first real episode on this podcast. They've done, they do episodes on market deals, off market deals. They do episodes on what's called a BRRRR, which stands for something, this might not be 100% correct, something along the lines of buy, renovate, raise the price, rent back out, something like that. I think I butchered that. But basically, you buy it, you fix it up, and you try to rent it out, and then you repeat, and then you do it again. So basically, you buy houses in distress, fix them up a little bit, rent them out, use some of that income, that rental income, to buy more properties and do the same thing. But Grant Cardone, for example, would never touch on that topic. He'll say only buy it if it's 16 units or more, which is a good strategy for making sure that the rent will pay the mortgage. But it's not really good if you only have $100,000 to start out, unless you're willing to go into a bunch of debt, which I'm not. So realistically, Grant Cardone is once you're up there a little higher, whereas Bigger Pockets will cover something that not everybody, but basically they will cover a larger range of capabilities financially. So if you want to do the type of stuff that Grant Cardone's doing, you're going to need, if you want to do it without going into debt, probably, $300,000, $400,000. Bigger Pockets, all you need is enough to buy a house, a small house, like, I don't know, depends on the area, 60, 70,000 if you're buying a real bad one. I don't know, I'd recommend that. But Bigger Pockets, I recommend for the topics and for the plethora of real estate knowledge you'll get from the podcast. Grant Cardone, on the other hand, I think I like him a lot as a personality, and I think he's a very motivating person. He talks a lot about productivity and other stuff too, besides real estate. But so yeah, if you're into real estate, Bigger Pockets Real Estate Podcast, definitely one that you need to go listen to. Recommendation number 7 for me is going to be the Money with Katie show. So out of the 10 on my list, this is actually the only female host, and I like this girl for one specific reason, and that's that, aside from all the knowledge, she actually sounds a lot like me, and I don't mean her voice, but I mean the way that she thinks. I've never heard a girl especially, but even just another person at all, that talks as much like I think as this girl does. And it's actually, it's interesting to listen to, and I don't always talk as elegantly as she does, but she certainly does a very good job at caveating everything and stopping and making sure that all the I's are dotted before she continues on with the rest of her sentence. It's very interesting to watch, and she is just so intelligent that she's very fun to listen to. And she also, there's a lot that you'll learn from this podcast. She covers a bunch of different stuff. I would put her more in the category of Choose FI. She certainly covers a lot of knowledge, a lot of different topics related specifically to personal finance. She does a little bit of real estate stuff, but mostly personal finance. But she does more of the optimization stuff, kind of like Choose FI. But you're definitely going to want to go check her out. I think she is a very informative podcast host, and I think you'll get a lot of value out of her podcast. Recommendation number 8. This is more about business specifically, and this is a big leagues type stuff. This is once you honestly, I wouldn't. Let me put it this way: I'm not saying you shouldn't listen to this one first. You can do whatever you want, but if you don't have any money, it's kind of pointless, in my opinion, to do this, because if you're gonna start a business or if you're gonna make a product, you need some level of money to start out with. And if you don't have a job that you like, a job that's funding your lifestyle, if you're not living on less than you make, if you don't have a decent income, if you don't have a decent savings emergency fund, so that if your car breaks down, you can afford to replace it, all that stuff. You don't have a good financial base, you're not going to be able to start a business. And I've learned this the hard way. I really have learned this the hard way. And when I say that, trust me, I say it from experience. If you don't have a financial structure in place and a financial, I guess the best way of basically a floor, like you need a certain amount of money just to operate as a human before you can think about funding a business. And like I said, I've learned that the hard way, where I've had multiple business ideas and they're all cute until you realize that you can't fund them because you don't have any fucking money, and that's a problem. So if you want my personal recommendation, get your life together and get your own personal finance together before you go and try to start a business or invent anything crazy. Okay, that said, My First Million is the name of this podcast. Now, basically, what this is about is people, Sam Parr is the host of this podcast. He has a co-host, I think his name is Sean, and what they discuss is different ways that their guests that they interview, and also them themselves, have either made their first $1 million or different ideas that they kind of just throw out of nowhere that could, and they give these ideas away. Keep in mind, these two people are already rich, so they have no problem giving out ideas of ways to make money that I don't want to say they're lazy, because they're not lazy at all, but that they don't care enough to implement because they already have enough money, right? They're not going to go and put all their stuff on a line to try to make these new businesses work when they already have enough money to be very, very comfortable. So they're fine throwing these ideas out into the public, and they actually they find enjoyment in doing it. Let me give you an example of one of the podcasts I remember listening to from these people. What they did was they were talking about different potential business models that you could use AI for, and they listed out like eight different business models. Now this is pretty simple stuff. If you just hear me say what I said, you're gonna be like, oh well, that's pretty standard. That's the one that comes to mind, because basically these were actually pretty insightful, and I'm not going to get into exactly what the ideas were. You're going to have to listen to the podcast and find out. But basically, these were all things that have not been done yet, and they just kind of sat back and contemplated what are some ideas, what are some good uses for AI that nobody's thought of yet, and they thought of like 10 of them and just put them out in the open. And don't get me wrong, this is not an exclusively AI topic-oriented podcast by any means, but that's just one example of ideas that they'll put out there. It's not just ideas, though. They also bring on guests, and they talk about real-life scenarios of how real people made their first $1 million, how real people started their first business or their second business. And there's a lot of failures on this podcast. And when I say failures, I don't refer to people, but I mean I refer to occurrences. Like, there are a lot of people who have had failures and who have failed multiple times, and they're very well dissected. Like these conversations really go through the whole thing and how they messed up and what they would do differently if they could do it again. Also, if all their wealth was taken away from them, how would they make their first $1 million again? I think that's a question that's asked to a lot of guests, and some of the answers are very interesting. Definitely an amazing business podcast. I would definitely recommend you check it out. Number 9 is going to be another business podcast. This one's going to be a little different, and the reason for that is it's more along the lines of an entertaining podcast. So this is going to be Business Wars by Wondery. And Wondery is not a person. Wondery is a company. I'm just going to say right now, Wondery makes some of the best podcasts that I have ever heard. And you're welcome, Wondery. And I'm not being paid to say that. But Wondery, their podcasts are just amazing. So this is one of them. Amazing production level stuff. But between the voice actors and the hosts and the soundtrack music in the background, the suspense, like the music is it comes in suspenseful at the right time, sad at the right time, exciting. It's amazing. Very high production, very high quality. And that said, this is more of an entertaining thing. But what this is, like I said, the name of the podcast is Business Wars. What this podcast is a dramatized recreation of history, whether it's distant history or recent history, specifically pertaining to the battles between different companies in getting ahead in the market. So some examples are McDonald's versus Burger King, Netflix versus what was that other company? In fact, they're so obscure now that I don't remember it. The one that used to sell DVDs in the store. CNN versus Fox News. I'm sure they've got episodes in there on Microsoft versus Google. I mean, a lot of tech companies for sure, and a lot of other companies that people use on a regular daily basis. Nike versus Adidas. I know that was another one, and I'm not gonna play any soundtracks or any clips from this one in particular. But if you wanna check this out, I guarantee you, if you are at all interested in business, you will love this podcast and you'll be addicted to it. I would just take my word on that. Now I'm just gonna go on to number 10 and leave that where it is. Number 10 is going to be Money Wise, and this is hosted by Sam Parr, which is also one of the co-hosts of My First Million. So he's got 2 podcasts. So you ask, what is this one different from the last one? Well, the last one was about business. This one is about money, not necessarily business, but it's not about how you make money, nor is it about how you, it's not about, basically this is for people who are already rich. And it's interesting. I don't want to say that's necessarily a target audience, but it kind of is. But it's more like a backroom discussion where the door's cracked open, and there's a bunch of rich people in the room, but there's a bunch of poor people outside of the room listening in on a conversation. And that's kind of what this is, and it's very interesting. And it's how he set it up to be on purpose too. But basically, this is rich people talking with rich people about rich people problems, like tax problems not necessarily problems, but just how they do certain things. It's a very interesting podcast. I've listened to a couple episodes of it, and it makes you think. Like, I'm just going to say this, okay? Here's why I recommend this podcast, honestly. It's not because a majority of the issues in this podcast are going to be directly relevant to you, but it is because it starts making you think with a millionaire mindset or billionaire mindset. When you hear, without listening to podcasts, what types of numbers do you hear on a daily basis? You probably hear, that's going to cost me $10. Okay, I just bought a bag of chips for $10, which is an insanely high price for a bag of chips, but that's what it's going to cost me. Okay, I just bought a pair of shoes for $120. Okay, I have rent. It is $800, $1,400, depending on where you live. Okay, my car loan is going to be $27,000. Holy shit. That's probably, okay, highest number you might encounter if you are a responsible person with a decent amount of money. You just got a home and your home mortgage is going to be $300,000. Okay, wow, that's a lot of money. Sure. Now, you start listening to a podcast like this and you start hearing numbers get thrown around like $3.17 million. Okay, that's like 3,170,000. 4 billion. Now, there's not a whole lot of billionaires on this podcast, but if we're talking about companies that people have a stake in, my point is, you get these, like, somebody just, he just sold his house for $14 million and use half of that to invest. I mean, bigger numbers are getting thrown around constantly. The way I see it, and I know there is some level of truth to this, I don't know what the psychological concept is called. When you hear these numbers getting thrown around a lot, it gets your brain thinking bigger. It gets your mind, it kind of blows off some of the ceilings that your mind had, like, oh, I'm never going to have more than this amount of money, or I'm never going to make more than this amount of money per year, more than this, yeah. And when you hear that somebody makes, $3.5 million a month, you're like, what? That's your initial reaction. But when you hear that 30 times, your reaction is, oh, that's not much. I just heard, on the last episode, a guy made $50 million. That's $30 million a month is nothing. And it's so funny how everything is relative, but I think it's good. I think it's good for your mind to blow off some of those, what's the word? Some of those, oh God, there's a specific word I'm thinking of. Not fictitious, but basically they're not real. All those restraints that you have on yourself. Now, unless you have a very creative personality and you're going to invent something, chances of you going from $0 to 100 million in 10 years are basically zero. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't be a realist. You should definitely be a realist. But in order to set high goals, you need to be reasonably comfortable with high numbers. And I think if you shy away from high numbers because you think it's either not possible for you to obtain them, or you think, maybe it is possible for me to obtain them, but if I did, I wouldn't know what to do with it if I did. I don't think that's good. I think you should familiarize yourself with those bigger situations, owning multiple homes, owning even rental properties, having a couple $1 million. If it's not even imaginable to you to own $1 million, then, or a couple million, I think you need to really blow the cap off of what you think is a limitation for yourself. And maybe you never will own that. It's very possible, but that doesn't mean you can't imagine what it would be like. And not even just for the sake of, pretending. I'm not saying you should pretend, but I'm saying that you should simulate, right? Which is very different word. I want to be a helicopter pilot. And what do you do before you fly a plane or a helicopter for the first time? You use a flight simulator, whether it's a helicopter or an airplane. What's the purpose of a flight simulator? The purpose of a flight simulator is to get you accustomed to all the controls and all the procedures and all the physics of what you're going to be doing later, but get you accustomed to it in a situation that has less of negative consequences if you mess up. Basically, you're conditioning your brain to work with the circumstances that you're going to have to deal with later, but you're having your brain do those things before it actually has to do them. And then you're in a much better position to actually deal with a real life situation once you get in that cockpit of a helicopter. In the same way, I would say condition your brain to know not everything about having a lot of money, but a decent amount of the things about having a lot of money. And if you do that, it's going to be like your brain's going to be telling you every single day, Josh, you're used to these numbers with all these zeros on it. Why are you making a deal for $10,000 when your brain is used to numbers that have 3 more zeros on it because you've been listening to all these podcasts? And what it does is it forces you to think bigger. And maybe your actions follow as a result of where your mind is automatically going because of all the information you fed into it, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just doesn't work out, and maybe your life stays with a couple of zeros less than you had conditioned your mind to work with. But I certainly think that blowing the limits off of your mind in terms of adding a couple more zeros to the numbers you're used to hearing and the numbers you're used to imagining yourself working with, I think that is extremely beneficial. I think that your actions will follow where your mind goes. And if you make $100,000 a year and your mind is telling you that that's good enough, then okay, that's fine. And if you're happy, then that's fine. But if you want to progress any farther than that, you need to blow the lid off some of the limitations that you think you have. And that was number 10. So that's all I've got in terms of podcast recommendations. Just to end it off, I used to assume that everybody kind of thought the way I did and had the same type of brain that I did. And I know that not everybody does. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a condescending way, but I mean it in the sense that some people learn differently. Some people have a different mindset when it comes to the types of things they're interested in or the types of priorities that they have. And not everybody is geared toward entrepreneurial stuff. And, that's definitely okay. I mean, there are people that, I think there's different types of people. There are people that are okay with being an employee for their entire life and then retiring on a pension. And then there are people that would like to start a business, but they want to start a service business in which they are the primary provider of the service. So, for example, a hairdresser or a lawyer or an accountant or something like that. You're starting your own business, and that's definitely entrepreneurial. But you are the person that's providing the service. You're still trading your time for the money. Even though you have your own business, you're still your own boss. You don't have to answer to anybody else other than, of course, government and stuff. And, legal regulations, all that. But even though you're still your own boss, you still have to trade your time for money. The only way your company makes money is if you put your own time in. If you're an accountant and you own your own accounting firm, and it's just you and maybe a receptionist, right? Or maybe you and a partner. Either way, your time is what's bringing in your income. You're a hairdresser, you start your own business, or if you're a restaurant owner, it's a small restaurant, it's maybe just you and one other employee or bartender, and like you own the bar and you're it. That's all you got. Your time is the only thing that generates the money. I should stop clicking my pencil. The microphone's probably picking that up. And then there's a third type of person, which is the type of person who wants to start a business, but the business that they want to start is a type of business where their time is not the thing that generates money, but rather they invest in some other type of function that generates money, whether it's somebody else's time, or maybe it's a machine's time, or maybe it's a product, right? If a machine or another person would apply to a service, maybe they just invent a product and they just hire a third-party fulfillment service to ship out the product. That would be like an inventor when they decide to produce it themselves and everything. So basically, first type of person, you're okay working for somebody else. Second type of person, you don't want to work for somebody else, but you're still okay trading your time for money. Third type of person, you don't want to work for somebody else and you don't want to trade your time for money either. I would say I'm the third type of person, and not everybody is like that. Not everybody, and that's okay. I mean, other people, people have different priorities. And some people, if you want to be a CEO at Google or a CEO, a lot of CEOs, now this isn't all of them. Some CEOs I'm sure are entrepreneurs, but a lot of CEOs, they start down towards the bottom somewhere, maybe not at the very bottom, but definitely not at the top, and they work their way up. There are a lot of very interesting and cool positions to have that are corporate positions where you're working for somebody else, and it makes you a lot of money. You don't have to be an entrepreneur to make a lot of money. You don't have to own rental properties. But for me, I find all this as an opportunity to make it so that I don't have to spend time earning income. I can put systems in place that make me money automatically while I'm doing whatever the hell I want, whether or not the thing that I'm doing in terms of how my time is being spent is generating revenue or not. I could care less. For example, I want to be a helicopter pilot, but I'm not doing it for the money. I mean, supposedly it makes a little money after you do it for a while. But I'd rather, by the time I become a helicopter pilot, have rental. Well, hopefully it doesn't take me that long to become a pilot. I mean, I'm getting there slowly, that's for sure. But my point is, by the time I'm a pilot, I'm hoping that I have other sources of income to where I could be a pilot or not be a pilot, and it would not make much of a difference financially for me because I have other sources of income, and I'm flying because it's fun and it's something I want to do. And if for some reason I don't want to do it anymore, then I'll just go do something else, and it could be playing golf, even though I don't have the slightest interest in golf. But my point is, that's why all this stuff interests me a lot. If you're the first type of person, I would say Dave Ramsey and Ken Coleman very much apply to you. I would say those are your biggest places to start. And Ramit Sethi definitely can have a big impact on you if you're married, even if you're single. But if you're the third type of person, My First Million, Money Wise, Choose FI, Bigger Pockets Real Estate Podcast, Grant Cardone, Money with Katie, if I didn't already mention her. Those are all podcasts that I know you're going to find interesting if you haven't already heard of them and if you haven't already listened to them. So I think that's about all I have to say for this podcast. There are different types of people out there, different priorities, and you can live. At the end of the day, all of us, for the most part, have the same amount of years in this life, and money definitely has an impact. But at some point, it just becomes. And when I say at some point, I mean after it gets over high enough of an amount, it just becomes an arbitrary number that doesn't really have a lot of meaning in terms of your satisfaction in life. So obviously the correlate, law of diminishing returns, if you've ever taken economics, after a certain point, the benefit of it becomes less and less and less. So people, there are people all over the place. I have very, very happy employees that are much happier than people that have tried to be entrepreneurs and vice versa. There's nothing to say that you're less intelligent for wanting to be an employee your entire life. It just depends on what you want. And for me, my priorities are utilizing as much of my time in my life as possible and spending it exactly how I want to spend it, and working 40 hours a week is not my idea of how I want to spend any significant portion of my life. Hopefully that trend ends in 5 to 6 years for me if I do everything right, which, knowing me, I probably won't, but it's a goal, and I am not one to be preaching when it comes to any financial stuff, because I've tried to implement a lot of stuff, and I will say I have been very organized in my finances, but being organized is not the same as being restrained, and I have not been very restrained, and I will admit that. I've kind of felt the repercussions of that very, very harshly recently, and so I would say I'm kind of on a turnaround, and I would say, based on some of the experiences I've had, it's only up from here. I've definitely suffered from stupidity as much as anyone else, and I would say it's pretty level playing field. I think that if you listen to some of these podcasts, now the podcasts aren't going to do anything. Let me just tell you that right now. You have to have a motivation, right? Knowledge and motivation are two very, very important things if you want to get anywhere. You have to have a motivation to succeed. Now, I have been listening to all these podcasts for years and years and years, and yet I was in a pretty, I've really boiled myself down. I don't want to say to rock bottom. I'm not at rock bottom, but I've boiled myself down to a spot where I didn't think I would be. And you have to ask, how did you get here? And for me, the answer is I had all the knowledge, but I didn't have much motivation. And when I say I didn't have much motivation, I don't mean motivation to do stuff, because I certainly had a lot of motivation to act, but I didn't have a lot of motivation to put into practice the stuff that I learned, specifically just the basic stuff, like making significantly more than you spend. I mean, lifestyle inflation is the idea that your spending always rises to match your income, not because it has to, but because your brain says, "Oh, I'm making more, so that means I get to spend more." And that's not how you should live, but it's exactly what I've been doing, and I need to stop. But the reason that I haven't stopped, even though I knew that I should, even though I had the knowledge, was because I didn't have the motivation to stop, because I still wanted to spend excessively on stuff. And now I'm kind of in a spot where I'm realizing how much of a problem that is, and I have a lot more motivation now than I did before to actually put some of this stuff into motion and to start putting into practice the stuff that I knew all along, but I just kind of pretended that it didn't apply to me for some dumb reason. And so that's why I say the motivation has to come too. But you listen to this podcast, you listen to all these podcasts, or maybe just some of them, depending on if you have entrepreneurial interests or not. But you listen to Dave Ramsey specifically. He's a big one. You got to start with him. You listen to Dave Ramsey, maybe Ken Coleman, maybe Choose FI, Money with Katie. Listen to some of these people. That's going to give you all the knowledge in the world. It's not going to give you the motivation. It's not going to get you anywhere. What's going to get you anywhere is when you realize how much you actually need this stuff, which is probably going to be after you learn it, but it's not going to be until you experience the hardship of not putting it into practice. When you experience that moment of realizing that you are in a rut and you're not going to get out of it unless you change something, that's what gives you the motivation to actually put into practice the stuff you've learned. But if you have that motivation but don't have the knowledge, then that's just going to be frustrating. You're just going to be like, I don't like my situation and I don't know how to get out of it. But if you listen to all these podcasts, at least you have the knowledge so that when you do finally get that motivation to change your situation and to put yourself on an escalating slope of income, net worth, whatever it is, you now have the knowledge to do it. You know what to do, and you can sit down and you can change your future for the better. So that was my intention in making this episode, was kind of giving you guys some sources of knowledge that are relatively easy to access. If you work a job where you can listen to a podcast, it's easy to just put headphones in and listen to this stuff. Build up your knowledge base, and when you need the stuff, it'll be there. And if you have entrepreneurial interests, that's even a bonus, because you'll learn from a lot of these other episodes. And if you're really not interested in the educational aspect, listen to Business Wars, because that is very entertaining, and you'll find it an interesting story podcast, even absent any educational value derived from it. That's going to wrap up this episode. I will see you in my next one.